Here I come. How's my hair? That's great. Okay. Hi, you guys. Welcome. Okay, welcome to Historical Events and Graphic Novels. Yay! How exciting. So this is Erin Christian, immediately to my right. She's a secondary educator in Denver, Colorado. And further to my right is Paul Jenkins, comic creator and writer who you've heard of before. And I'm Selena. I'm from the Holocaust Awareness Institute at the University of Denver, also in Denver, which would make sense. Wow, Selena. I just walked up the hill both ways, so I'm really tired. But we're going to make it. So we are here to talk about historical events, and Erin has a quote for you.
Literature teacher, big fan, William Faulkner, and I feel like this quote is especially apt today in 2024, of the past is never dead, it's not even past. You know, with these graphic novels, some of them are higher level or perhaps not necessarily appropriate for the middle school classroom, but many of them I do teach, but one of the things that I'm extremely passionate about is trying to remind my students that things that might seem so far departed from them at 12 years old in 2024 actually are not. They have ripple effects that are happening, that lead to things that are happening today, and how like just the different literature around some of human history's like major events can be a doorway for us to connect us to things that have shaped our world and current events, so that we can see, you know, how did we end up here where we are in so many different geopolitical ways around the world.
So we're going to start telling you about some historical events in war, and we're going to let Paul jump in whenever you feel like jumping in.
Sure, yeah, no, I'll just join in.
Go ahead, Erin.
Yeah, so we start off, we kind of organize these, we organize these a bit chronologically, and tried to cover a variety of different areas around the globe. And we are starting with Boxers and Saints, which is a long favorite of both mine and Selena's. I'm a big fan of Yang's work. And he stated when he was originally working on this piece that one of his interests in the Boxer Rebellion was learning how at the time it was such a cultural shift, and the idea of becoming Christian was perceived as like forsaking Chinese culture. He grew up Roman Catholic in a Chinese American community in the San Francisco Bay, and so in his mind he was trying to connect those dots of like how does that work, and it's a two-parter that covers the story of Little Bao, who is from the Shandong province, who becomes a leader in the Boxer Rebellion. And then Saints, that's Boxers, and then Saints follows the story of a girl who adopts the name Viviana, and she comes from the same village but becomes a Catholic, and like aspires to kind of reach the glory of Joan of Arc in her mind. And he said that he wanted to do these two sides of a conflict because he wanted to demonstrate like that even it's hard to put things into boxes of good and bad, and the good guys and the bad guys. And he wanted a quote from him that I really love about this piece is he said, you know, I was trying to write the story of a young man who was seen at the time as essentially a terrorist, and I wanted him to be sympathetic, but I also didn't want the book to seem like I was condoning terrorism. And he wanted these two characters to show the two sides of this story and just kind of get all aspects of the conflict, or as much as they can.
The Harlem Hellfighters, in 1919, the 369th Infantry Regiment marched home triumphantly from World War I. They'd spent more time in combat than any other American unit, and they never lost the foot of ground to the enemy, nor a man to capture. And they won countless decorations. And they returned as heroes. Nope, go back, don't do that to me. However, as soon as they got home, they got discrimination from their own government and treated horribly because of civil rights and all of that. The Harlem Hellfighters is what the Germans called them. They fought courageously on and off the battlefield, to make Europe and America safe for democracy. And this is a very powerful comic. It's written well, it's really well told, and it's just lovely artwork. But it's a story that nobody knows and should know, and so we've included that one here. It's a very powerful story.
And if you're a fan of Max Brooks, Max Brooks is phenomenal at different historical and societal pieces.
Trinity. Trinity depicts the dramatic history of the race to build the atomic bomb. It goes all the way back to, it's the decision included to whether or not they were going to even build it. So it goes back to World War II. It's a sweeping historical narrative, and it traces the spark of invention from the laboratories in the 19th century Europe to the massive industrial and scientific efforts of the Manhattan Project. It'll transport you all the way back into a nuclear reaction, into splitting atoms themselves. So it gives you the whole history. It's fascinating and a little bit terrifying.
Yeah. And so Selena and I are actually a little bit later today doing an entire panel devoted to World War II and the Holocaust.
And Paul's going to come with us.
And Paul too, yes, I'm sorry, yes, and of course. And so I wanted to highlight Berlin as perhaps a little bit more of a niche piece. We've all seen Maus, which is gorgeous and beautiful and a masterpiece. But I love this concept that is done in Berlin, where Berlin, the city itself, is sort of like the main character as it's being ripped apart by like the growing rise of fascism at the time. And Jason Lutz spent 20 years on this piece, painstakingly researching it, pulling from many primary sources. It's really beautifully done. And I feel like it's unique in a sense that he just has this chilling detail of the insidious rise of fascism, coupled with, I feel like, really complex character studies of people in this city who actually are, facing this slow growing cancer in their society. And it tracks the rise of this authoritarian strangulation of intellectualism, creativity, values that would be considered, more liberal through the eyes of the Berlin citizens, and again, kind of hearkening to things we deal with now, with our book bans and different things that we're dealing with across the United States. So I feel like this is a really powerful piece to connect past and present. And these are pieces that I've taught. Well, the best we could do, I've definitely taught at the high school level, but Persepolis I have at both levels. But we've covered, we start with the best we could do in the fall of South Vietnam. We have our main character, who is an autobiographical piece after Bui's experiences of displacement and the trauma that her family underwent after the fall of South Vietnam. And we also see this kind of universal struggle as well, the human condition of she's struggling to figure out, what does it mean to be a parent? What are the sacrifices I need to do? As well as how do we survive myself and my child, this huge level of displacement that we are undergoing. And Persepolis, I feel like is something that a lot of us are familiar with, but it's a really gorgeous piece about the rise of the Islamic Revolution in Tehran and how this political upheaval causes such personal upheaval, and her family is part of a lot of the protesting and a lot of the standing up against authoritarianism that is happening. And she also ends up spending her high school years in Vienna, so there's this clash of cultures that she's trying to process throughout the graphic novel. And I think that one of the especially poignant parts of this piece is that as she ages, so when it starts, in chronological progression, she's quite young and a small child, and then she gets older and older, and the language of the novel also develops along with her, and her understanding. And later in the book, and when she's covering her adult years, she even breaks the fourth wall a few times. And this is a piece that has also faced many challenges across the United States. I've gotten pushback myself for teaching it in the classroom. But I think that it is one that is definitely worth fighting for because it puts Iranian history into a perspective that is different than the traditional Western narrative. So it highlights how there was so much heavy Western influence in the regime change that caused all this chaos, and it discusses, or like covers like little bits and pieces about how the United States provided weapons for both Iran and Iraq, and just heavy focus on the citizens. There's this idea of othering that happens so much in different cultures and in our culture, and it's us versus them, and this is like, no, these are citizens who are just trying to live their lives, and suddenly their whole world is turned upside down.
I feel like I can add something to this, Carly. I finally got something, because I don't have a presentation. The challenge that you face as a writer always is to, in my opinion, is to turn the mirror to the person that's reading. It has to be about you, anybody reading, right? So how do we translate something that happened hundreds, thousands of years ago to now? And what we do is we have to determine when do we take creative license. It's very hard, right? How am I supposed to take creative license and put words in the mouth of Alexander the Great if I wasn't there? And the idea is, you try to understand the context of it, and you try to understand these people as people. So just on Persepolis, this is not about the comfortable story of anything. It's about what happened in the revolution. And that every single time it always pertains to people. And as a writer, I've had to write stories in the English Civil War. I've had to write stories, across thousands of years, and I've always had to humanize a person that's just on paper if we don't. So if I have to write about Cleopatra, or if I have to write about Boudica, and I want to because they're such fascinating people, if I'm going to do that, I have to turn them into people. That means I have to take some creative license and pretend that I was there and pretend that people can be there. Otherwise, you're never going to connect to them. You do not connect to dates in history. You do not connect to things that happened, but you do connect to the people that were there because you're a person too. And I think that's the benefit of seeing a book like Persepolis. It's about what really happened, about the people that were really there.
Yeah, absolutely. And like as a teacher too, that's a common struggle with my students is their limitations in terms of, they're just developmentally, they're still quite young, but also just the idea of, this feels, why should I care about what happened in Iran in 1979? 1979 feels like it was a million years ago. I don't know if y'all have a lot of middle schoolers in your lives, but they have now started saying the 1900s.
I was born before 1979.
So if y'all, I saw the collective in the audience. They asked me my age one time, and I told them I was born in 1986, and they said, "You were born in the 1900s." And so for them, this seems like such a long time ago. And I agree, when you bring it down to the people, these are human beings just like you and I, and these are things that have happened to them, and especially with Persepolis, but other pieces we're going to talk about as well, who are, start with the characters or the subjects being youth, children and teenagers. It really helps bridge those gaps, I think, for kiddos as well.
I was born before 1979, and I don't want to talk about it.
Continuing on too, with this piece, I feel like Waltz with Bashir. So we're covering a horrific event that happened in September 1982. There is an area that Israeli soldiers secure, and as they are securing the area and kind of standing guard, Christian militia members entered some refugee camps of Sabra and Shatalia and began to massacre Palestinians. The author, Ari Folman, was one of those soldiers at the time. And this is a piece that covers the trauma of that experience. He lost his memory for quite a long time of this experience. It was largely blocked out. And then he starts to learn, he starts to talk with a friend, and he starts to kind of try to excavate the truth of what happened, what was I doing, what was my role in this, why were we doing this, why were we soldiers standing while this was happening, and he tries to piece his own life experience back together. And so I think that it not only in featuring a part of history that might be often overlooked in terms of the specific massacre, but it also is a really interesting depiction of how the mind protects itself from trauma, and how he connects his personal reconstruction of his memories to the facts he understands about the war. And it probes into this idea of like how reliable is memory, and also it is a very strong denunciation of war in general and violence in general, which I think makes for a powerful piece, because it's coming from someone who was perhaps in the sense of like the aggressor in that instance of standing there and like allowing this to happen. So I think the fact that he takes that look at himself and what he was doing is just really moving.
Ari also does a fabulous Anne Frank graphic novel that's approved by the Anne Frank House.
Yeah, it's the only one approved by the Anne Frank House, which I also teach.
It's gorgeous.
And kind of tied to that, so we're gonna talk about Joe Sacco a couple of times in here. He is like one of the premier graphic novel journalists, and he wrote another piece that we're going to talk about soon called Palestine, but in this case he spent 5 months in Bosnia in 1996 living among the locals, immersing himself into the human side of wartime, again like pulling back to the human element of all of this, and he focuses on this Muslim-held enclave which was besieged by Bosnian Serbs during the war, and he lived there for about a month and just interviewed folks, got to know everybody, became part of the community. He's living in this space where everyone is trapped. They don't have access to the outside world. They don't have electricity. They don't even have running water. And he uses a very photojournalistic, black and white drawing style, telling about this safe zone, but is actually not safe like at all. And he covers the stories of all of these folks. There are young folks who are just desiring, they miss being able to smoke and drink. There are folks who miss being able to have access to Western movies and music, or who are just tired of being cut off from the world and news and updates. There are folks who are, wanting to wear makeup or just put on a pair of blue jeans. There's one man who I find poignant who has memorized a news, like from cover to cover, a Newsweek magazine, and he uses that as entertainment and like shares that with folks periodically. And there are many folks who haven't seen their family in Sarajevo for years, and it just focuses on their humanity, their hopes and dreams, and what they are, how they are holding on to different things to survive. And then with Palestine, this won an American Book Award in 1996. Again, based off of extensive research and an extended visit. So he stayed in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in the early 1990s, interviewing many Israelis and Palestinians during that time. This was one of the first major comics works of like a political and historical nonfiction piece that he had done. And a quote from his that I think, again, is pretty powerful about his work on this piece. He said, "I grew up thinking of Palestinians as terrorists, and it took a lot of time and reading the right things to understand the power dynamic in the Middle East was not what I thought it was. And basically it upset me that I wanted to go and in a small way give the Palestinians a voice, a lens through which people could see their lives. There are two ways which the Palestinians are portrayed, as terrorists or as victim. There may be truth in certain situations for both descriptions, but Palestinians are also people going to school who have families, have lives, invite you into their home and think about their food," end quote. And this piece has often been compared actually to Art Spiegelman's Mouse for its ability to like navigate this socially and politically sensitive subject within the comic book medium. And I think kind of continuing to tie to a lot of the theme in a lot of these pieces is showing the humanity, showing that people are more than stereotypes and more than what often we box them into. And then our next piece on the slide, with Exit Wounds, it is set in a more modern sense of in Tel Aviv. It focuses around a young man, Kobe Franco, who receives a call that his estranged father may have been a victim of a suicide bombing. And so it focuses again on the personal through to like kind of explore the political, where he begins searching for clues and trying to figure out what happened to his father, and trying to figure out like the mystery of his death. And he also ends up learning a lot more about his father's identity, who he was, what he valued. And I feel like Modan creates a really complex portrait of sort of life in Israel at this time. And she has won a variety of awards in Israel and abroad, including like the Best Illustrated Children's Book Award and Young Artist of the Year. And especially in Israeli culture, she's kind of coming up in a very male-dominated medium. And so it's really interesting to see her work and her take on everything.
So you've heard of Mouse. Art Spiegelman also talks about In the Shadow of No Towers is about 9/11. And it's not just the story of the towers coming down, it's his experience of the towers. So this is the Pulitzer Prize winning author. It's less about the action. No, stop it. What did I say? Computer. It's less about the actual events, though there are many facts. It's more about his reaction. So you feel his trauma and you feel his anger and confusion that everyone else isn't experiencing his trauma. And we know that people did, but he expected people to experience it the way he experienced it. So it's an interesting comic. It's a huge book. It's about this big. And it's about 10 pages and they're heavy cardboard. So if you get your hands on it, I didn't bring it because it's heavy cardboard and I flew in from Denver. And so they're just heavy, and there's a lot of reprints of what he kept seeing in his mind, which is the burning skeleton of the buildings. And it's reprinted on several pages, and that's what he kept seeing. And so it's very powerful, and it's terrifying because he goes a little bit off the rails, poor Art, because he really went through some stuff with seeing the towers go down.
You know what's really interesting about 9/11 especially is at the time I was writing Spider-Man, I was writing the Hulk, I think, and I was doing like 4 or 5 comics for Marvel at the time. And so I was also at a convention in Spain, and I was trapped, and I was going to get married, so I couldn't get back. And when we flew back, the pilot actually diverted the plane and flew us through the smoke from the towers on purpose.
Oh my goodness. Oh.
So that we would not remember it, we would not forget it. And I was really appreciative of that. I thought it was an incredible thing that he did. We were actually going, it was a strange moment, but one of the things that's really interesting about 9/11, being a writer that's currently working in the business at that time, what do I write about it? Joe Straczynski, who wrote the other Spider-Man book, wrote about it immediately. And everybody read this thing, and I was like, I don't know how to write about this right now. I don't know what to say. I don't know if you can take, I think we have to have the lens of perspective, even if it is a human story, and I didn't know whether to write about it, and I didn't write about it. It took me ages to write about it. I put it in that book, actually, some of it. Because how do we feel? And I thought that one thing that was really difficult, and I think this probably speaks to some of the other authors in these books, if you've experienced it, you may want to say something about it, but when do you say it, right? I couldn't possibly have the perspective of writing about 9/11. I was actually separated for a couple of weeks. I was about to get married, and so my wife and I were talking all the time, and I was just making sure she was okay. I never forget going through the smoke. I never forget getting back to Atlanta airport and getting out, and there was nothing in the sky. It was completely silent. There weren't planes. There was just a few planes that had returned. So the world had changed. And how do we write something that's that big, even if it's that big locally? it may not be a worldwide event like Persepolis, but it might be something that you know really well. So it was an interesting thing because I can only write a human experience, and I didn't know how to write a human experience of what happened on 9/11. I spoke at a conference called the CUSP Conference. I was one of the, it was this crazy conference, and two of my best friends now, one of them is a soldier that was, he's in that book too. He used the first triple amputee to survive his injuries in Iraq. He lost one arm and both legs, and the conference happened on 9/11, right? A couple of years after 9/11. Out comes Brian to talk about what happened. Then a guy called Lyle Awerko, who's the guy that took that famous photograph, the most famous photograph where the plane hits the tower. The way he got that photograph was that he was moving to where the light was the best. And he just was setting up, and just as he set up, he took that photograph. Listening to Lyle talk about the people throwing themselves out of the building, this horrific thing that we all know, I've never been able to watch any film about it, or Flight 19 or whatever it was, any of those things, because it's still raw to me. And so you don't write about it. I think there's a lot of courage in people that write about really, really difficult things and put it right in there. So that's the human side of it, is how do we write about this stuff, because it means a lot. And yet I read about my family in wartime constantly, so it's one of those really hard things.
It took Spiegelman a long time to write about that too.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting coming from like a trauma perspective. So I'm also, as a teacher, I'm also a survivor of a mass shooting. The school that I taught at in 2019 was STEM School Highlands Ranch, and we had a shooting in the room right next door to my classroom. And thinking about how do you write about that, and I'm a writer on a very small scale, but it took me, it's been almost 6 years now, but it took me like what seemed like quite a long time to be able to actually start to like deconstruct that experience and write about it. And what I went through is not as well known as 9/11 or like other larger, like Parkland or Columbine. Like my school was small, a small school in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, but like one of the things I find so interesting about so many of these pieces too is how like going back to Waltz with Bashir, like how they reconstruct trauma and memory and how that can tie to historical events and that sort of thing is just really fascinating to me. And the ability to face these things that are on a societal and personal level just so shocking and devastating.
That's why it's so fascinating. History, and you see the word history and you're sort of like, yeah, okay, that was a long time ago. But the fact is that everything is immediate. In fact, if you think about it, that thing that happened that's memorable, that is supposedly a historical event, is really an event that happened to people, and it's happening again, and it will always happen, and it's our job to kind of catalog it and write about it, But it's history isn't some imprint that just happened and you write it up on a wall. It's literally a series of events that happen to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And animals, in some instances. With Pride, I think that this is such a fascinating piece because it actually looks at this war through the perspective of actual lions. And so this is a true story, that as the war in Iraq was blazing forward in 2003, like a variety of animals escaped the Baghdad Zoo. It's chaos, destruction everywhere. And instead of focusing on this from a human perspective, it focuses on this destruction from the animals' perspective themselves. And so it's kind of been compared to as almost like a modern Aesop's fable type situation. And the animals had been abandoned in the zoo, their caretakers had fled, and their enclosures are damaged and they escape, and they don't really understand how to navigate this new freedom. What do we do? How do we survive? And how do we escape the horror that is happening around us? And so it's a really interesting piece that explores the nature of survival and the nature of what does it mean to be free, even in such a horrific situation. And I just think it's a really interesting look at war from a perspective that honestly, I haven't personally seen done in a similar way in other forms of media.
Now you can move. Go on, advance. Okay, slavery has some stories that have not been told before that really need to be told. The Banner of King Death. You're like, Selena, this is about pirates. Why are you telling me slavery? But it is. So the Pirates of the Caribbean that we've seen before is not real piracy. You're like, but yes, no, I know. Mutiny, blood battle, and social revolution. It novelizes the real pirates, the outsiders behind the legends. So Under the Banner of King Death is set at the pinnacle of the golden age of Atlantic piracy, and it follows three unlikely companions who are sold into servitude on a merchant ship and unwittingly thrust into a voyage of rebellion. So that was really what it was about. When you were on merchant ships and you were sold into slavery, piracy became about getting out of slavery and becoming pirates because you did not want to be a slave on a merchant ship. And so it's breaking into freedom. And so when Jack Sparrow talks about freedom, that's what piracy is freedom. That was literally what piracy was really about. And so that's what Under the Banner of King Death talks about. It's got a lot of glossary terms so that you can learn about it. They don't tell you, explain it in the comic. They just use the terms, and you can go back and look in the glossary and go, oh, that's what that means. Which is really helpful because it is. Run For It is a stunning graphic novel. Wow, I tried to say them at the same time, that failed me. By an illustrator whose name I'm going to butcher because my French is horrific. Marcelio de Salate. And it's one of the first literary and artistic efforts to face up to Brazil's hidden history of slavery. It was originally published in Brazil, and it was nominated for 3 of the country's most prestigious awards. It's received rave reviews worldwide, including here in the US, in the Huffington Post. They're intense tales, and they're tragic, and they're gripping, and they're a portrait of one of the history's darkest corners of slavery. Brazil doesn't usually tell you that it had slavery, and it did. It's really hard to look away from this book. It's just really powerful. You know, you often will hear me say this is one of my favorites. You could probably take a drink every time I say this is one of my favorites and get really, really smashed. Don't do that at DragonCon, however, you could do that. Profit Against Slavery is another very rarely told story about Benjamin Lay, who was a Quaker. It's based on the award-winning biography of Marcus Rediker. It sparked a Quaker community to re-embrace Lay after 280 years of disownment. They disowned him because he was a Quaker. He was also on the outside because he was also a hunchback and an albino. And he kept telling them, you're not real Christians if you own slaves. And they went, shh, shh. He was born in 1682 in Essex, England, before it was cool to be anti-slavery. And he understood the fundamental evil that slavery represented, and he would unflinchingly use guerrilla theater tactics to direct action to shame the slave owners in the Quaker community. And the traders too, and so, you know, this is evil, this is not Christian, don't do it. He was also a dwarf, and he was devout in his faith, and he was passionate about slavery and animal liberation, and he's like, stop doing it. And they're like, we push you to the outside, you are excommunicated, all that kind of stuff. And finally, after all of these years, almost 300 years, they finally went, okay, Benjamin was right. And now they have brought him back into the fold, even though he's been dead for a while. But it's a really cool story because we didn't know that he was around, and he really made some of the first action towards getting rid of slavery. And then Wake, Dr. Rebecca Hill is somebody that someday I need to meet. Dr. Hall, I'm sorry. The accepted history of slave revolts has always told that enslaved women took a back seat and this is not accurate. Dr. Hall takes a deeper look, and her journey takes her through old court records, slave ship captain's logs, crumbling correspondence, and even some forensic evidence from the bones of enslaved women from the Negro burying ground that she uncovered in Manhattan. So she has done extensive research to prove that women led slave revolts, and they did it with a passion. And so this is a really in-depth look at women's contribution to the slave revolts. And it's really good reading. These all are. They're all my favorites. And now we move to discrimination and civil rights. Oh, it's still me. Okay, so displacement and They Called Us Enemy are both about the Japanese internment camps. You may recognize They Called Us Enemy. First, let me talk about displacement because I will jump over it. So this is a teenager who's pulled back into time to witness her grandmother's experiences in World War II era Japanese internment camps. It is by Kiku Hughes. Stop doing that. I must be, it's me, I know it's me. I'm trying not to take responsibility for my own actions. She witnesses the lives of Japanese Americans who were denied their civil liberties and suffered, but they managed to cultivate community and commit acts of resistance to survive. And then They Called Us Enemy is by our friend George Takei. We actually talked to him. He's like, you talk about our comic? And his husband Brad was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So George knows that we do this, but he was very excited about it. So actor, author, activist George, these are his own childhood memories about being in the internment camp. This is also a very gorgeous, it looks just like George, and he's drawn sometimes as an adult, and it's uncanny how much it looks like him. It's beautiful, it's heartbreaking, I cannot recommend it enough. Do you teach?
I do.
You teach both of these?
I do.
Yeah. It's an important story in like all of history. As a staff member of the Holocaust Awareness Institute, I need you to remember how easy it is to discriminate. The Holocaust, the Japanese camps, the genocides, everything that we discuss here today, nobody imagines how easily it can happen again. It is already happening again from where it started. We don't see it in our places of where we sit in privilege. It is already happening. So there's that.
I tend to think that we know it's happening.
Yes.
We just don't do anything about it. I recently saw this interesting documentary about like those, the premises, those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat it, except that's not accurate. And psychologists talk about it a lot. It's not that you learn from history and then repeat, you don't repeat, it's just societally, we just can't get out of this thing. So that in fact we are going to repeat it because it's not immediate to us right now until the vice is squeezed and all of a sudden we find we don't have the freedoms and all those things. So we don't learn from history not because we don't understand history, but we don't care enough.
It's true because it doesn't involve us, so therefore, it's true. We fangirled, Erin and I, all over this slide. It's just everywhere. These two are both, let's see, so Bombshells United is a newer one, 2017, by Team Marguerite, Bennett and Savage. And we met Marguerite over here. She's in a picture with me. There I am. I'm dressed as Joy from Don't Mind the Blue Hair, Inside Out. So the DC ladies in Bombshells United are all younger, and they go back. The first one, Wonder Woman goes back in time to stop the Japanese internment camps from happening. She stops the bus from taking them there because they go back and fix stuff that they don't like that America did. Those are kind of cool. And then in the other one, we already talked about Jean from Boxers and Saints. And this is Superman Smashes the Klan. Now they had to change the name of the clans to avoid legal issues. However, this is 1946 and the Lee family has moved to from Chinatown to downtown Metropolis. This is back before Superman figured out he could fly. And Yang writes this exciting middle grade tale featuring Superman, and it's so much fun. And here's the really cool part if you don't know. This graphic novel and the accompanying radio show got so much traction that it dropped the numbers of members in the Ku Klux Klan. Because everybody went, oh, Daddy Superman doesn't think it's cool to be in the Klan. You better stop that. Yeah.
What year was that published?
Hmm?
What year was that published?
This was published, I know the answer to that.
Was it
I know
the
this.
1900s?
The story takes place in 1946. What?
I was asking, what year was it published? Was it the 1900s?
Yes.
You know what, rude.
See what you did there?
I see what you did there. Yes, that was good. But we do have it on our list, so you can scan this barcode. I know that the date that it was published is actually on our list, which I don't have in front of me. But if you scan this, or there's going to be a bigger one up on the screen, and you can take this free thing that's literally got more than we even have on this list, because we had to cut several of our darlings because we only get like an hour total.
2020.
It was not in the 1900s.
By the way, there's another one, Sergeant Rock, The Lost Battalion by Billy Tucci. Have you seen that one? It's about Japanese-American soldiers that went and rescued a battalion that was trapped in the Battle of the Bulge. And so despite all the things that happened in Japanese internment camps, and I want to say that there were a ton of medals won in that particular situation. They were completely outnumbered, and despite all the things that happened to their family at home, here come these kids, and they go and they save a Texas battalion that was stuck on a hill. And it's really fascinating, and it's Sergeant Rock, right? So it's weird because I've worked with these mainstream characters, and I in the Inhumans, one of the first things I did for Marvel, I felt that the Inhumans were, I don't know if you guys are familiar with those characters, but I felt that it was like the melting pot of America is like literally trapped inside the Inhumans. And we did a whole thing about their slave race in a sense called the Alpha Primitives, where they had been freed but not freed, and it was such an easy parallel to draw to America. So you'll find that a lot of we're like really subversive. We do these like subversive actual truth writings inside American comics, and then they find out, and then they tell us off and say, don't do that again.
Okay.
March. Can't say enough about this piece. It is a first-hand account of John Lewis's struggle for civil and human rights. I teach this in my classroom as well, and he focuses on his personal story, and once again, I can't say this enough either, the personal teaches us about the political, and how he has undergone both his own personal growth and change and his different trials and tribulations in fighting for the civil rights movement. It is in a 3-part series. It's in a trilogy. We just have part 1 depicted here.
And I just want to point out, by the way, that they just replaced a Confederate statue here in Georgia with a big statue of John Lewis.
Yes. It's about damn time.
The Black Panther Party winner of an Eisner Award. It is completely, so incredibly complete. Names, dates, organizations, and more. It's so detailed. I would venture to say the only way to get more information is to have been in the Black Panther Party. It's just really a very complete book. It's gorgeous. I feel like I've said it's gorgeous about a lot of them. I shouldn't be an art critic.
Is it one of your favorites?
It's one of my favorites! You guys, it's so good. Especially if this is your genre, which I'm guessing for a lot of you, this is your genre. These are just really well done graphic novels. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have put them on here. Okay, sing me a Redbone song. You know one if you saw Guardians of the Galaxy.
Come and get your love.
I said sing.
Come and get your love.
Nice. That's good. So this is Native American civil rights movement and the resulting struggle for identity, told from the perspective of Pat Vegas to his kids and grandkids. We were all at Wounded Knee. We were all wounded at Wounded Knee. It made it huge in Europe, and it didn't make it huge in the U.S. However, that's one of their songs, and the book also talks about Wounded Knee. It also shows discrimination from the movement, and it continues currently against Native American tribe members. So while he's telling the story, it shows you discrimination at their own cafe. which is really obnoxious, and you kind of want to jump in the comic and go, back off, dude. He's telling you a story. This man is part of history. Do you mind? And you can't because you're physically not part of the comic, so you can't do that. But it's, again, one of my favorites.
Oh, good. It made the cut.
It did. It made the cut.
And I just want to cover this one quickly. So this is a larger kind of compilation piece. The original book was published in the 1990s, Lies My Teacher Told Me. And Nate Powell, who was also the first cartoonist to ever win a National Book Award, by the way, has adapted this work into a graphic edition, and it just kind of covers a wide variety of failures of American history texts, like common failures in American history textbooks, the common stories that are being whitewashed, and exploring like why does this whitewashing need to change. And then looking at time, and because I want to prioritize our queer history section,
We're going to skip
we have a random section, not random, but kind of random, of weird shit that the government has done.
You see the shit in here?
I don't know, but I just did.
I know I did too. We'll pause for a second to take a photo. MK Ultra, sex, drugs, and the CIA. Kent State. Please read it before you give that book to children.
I mean, both of these, yeah,
yes,
totally.
please. I mean, it's bloody, it's cartoony, but it's still bloody. There's a lot of stuff.
Leica is a big favorite among my middle school students, I will be fair.
It has to be, because it's about a dog.
It's about a dog, but then they always are so gutted. It's so sad.
Oh, no, don't even start talking about that.
I know. And Pyongyang, I would maybe, again, preview before you hand to children.
Oh, did you get a picture of that? Okay, good.
And then going into this section, so Alan Turing, I believe, has suffered one of the saddest and most frustrating and infuriating fates that I can possibly think of. He was a brilliant mathematician. He was solicited by the British government to help decipher messages sent by Germany's Enigma machines during World War II. The work of himself and his colleagues descrambled the German Navy's messages, saved so many millions of lives, so many British goods and merchandise, which some people tend to value over lives. However, when it came out that he was gay, he was charged with gross indecency and had to avoid prison, had to undergo chemical castration. And the trauma of this is said to have led to his suicide 2 years later. And this piece used a variety of once classified bits of information that were only made available in 2012 to make this both a scientifically rigorous yet understandable piece for the lay reader, and this intimate portrayal of this amazing, phenomenal human being living in a world that was completely intolerant to his identity.
Do you mind if I mention?
We're hoping you would.
Yeah. So when we first met recently, I explained a little bit about a book I'd done for Marvel called Band of Heroes, and the premise was pretty interesting. It was the idea that back in the 40s they published a lot of these like one and done characters. So Marvel would do like the Invisible Man, and it wouldn't be any good, and they'd go, yeah, that's it, we're finished with it. And then the Victory Boys, they lasted 2 issues, and they're like, yeah, they're not getting any traction. Then they would end up doing Spider-Man and go, that's great, okay, we'll keep it. But there were all these discarded characters. And so I created this premise whereby those weren't actually discarded, they were propaganda leaflets for people with emerging powers, and they all died in service of their country, and that's why they were only published once or twice. So the main thrust of it was about, in a sense, I wanted to write about Alan Turing, because I could not believe that this guy who had saved so many lives in the Second World War, it is hard to really fully encapsulate how the world changed because of Alan Turing. And yet he was prosecuted as a homosexual after the war. They finished with him, and so they were like, we're going to prosecute you now. because of his sexuality. So I wanted to write that, and imagine the irony. I start writing the story, and I have a couple of characters. One's a homosexual, well, a couple of them are, and they are put into a special unit, and I won't give away the story if anybody wants to find it, but basically at a certain point of it, two of the guys, one of the guys that's really had a hard time comes around the corner and finds the two guys kissing. And that's going to be a real problem for them, and that's going to be a problem for the way things are working out in that time and date. And it was a major plot point, right? So I got the artwork back, and they did the shadow of the two guys kissing, and I was fucking furious. And I was like, this is ridiculous.